Good. Thank you, Dr. Hooper. First, this is a new talk for me, so that's kind of good because it's new. And I was just going through the slides. The test at the end is, can you find the several typos that are in the slides? Because I was just going through them. And because it's new, I'm starting to clock on myself, make sure I don't get too long. Thanks, Dr. Hooper, for the very kind introduction. Don't make that sound like I can't keep a job. That sounded a little bit like that towards a couple of times. But going to be challenging to follow those first two presentations are really great. But hopefully we can talk a little bit about meta-analyses. Goody. So there's a lot of things in sport that you can measure, as the previous presentation showed. We're going to spend time on, I guess, the variables of resistance training and what we can kind of learn from meta-analyses. And I think we've got to put all of that into context, as was alluded to in the two previous presentations, of what are you training for? What are you trying to get ready for? Meta-analysis, although it's really hot right now in virtually every field, you can find meta-analysis on all kinds of stuff. But it's actually been around quite a while. This is actually a meta-analysis from 1988. It doesn't really matter what it says anymore because it's pretty old. And meta-analysis is really the basic calculation. There's some little innuendos about what you calculate, but it's really the mean change in the intervention group minus the mean change in the control group. It doesn't really matter which way you do that, it just changes the sign. Divided by the pooled baseline standard deviation. So what you're really getting is how many standard deviations is different in the change in the variable you're looking at. And the Cohen effect size scale is used a lot. There's a couple other scales, but really the bigger the change, 0.8 standard deviation, I mean, it's really difference between the two changes. It's called large, and then small, 0.2 to 0.49. I think with some of this, the danger is when you look at something this close, sometimes you can get lost. And I think the other thing we'll come to is the quality of the studies that are in meta-analyses. That's a big determinant. If all the studies are crappy, the outcome is not going to be all that reliable. If all the studies are really great, which unfortunately doesn't happen often, you got a lot more confidence in the results. So the first thing we're going to look at is a little bit on periodization. And I'm sure we're all familiar with classic periodization. Not going to take the time to review that. And what that is, you know, basically as the training progresses, intensity goes up, volume goes down. It's a little more complicated than that, but again, we're not really reviewing that. This is one of the first meta-analyses on types, on periodization, and basically came to the conclusion that periodization does result in greater strength gains than non-periodized studies. Works in pretty much everybody, men, women, experienced, inexperienced lifters. Greater difference actually with inexperienced versus non-periodized. So that actually answers one real simple question that you get once in a while is, you know, should I start the periodized training pretty early? This meta-analysis says yes. Periodization is actually more effective with the less experience. I think you got to get to, hey, you got to lift safely and you got to know what you're trying to do and all of those things, but initiate periodization. Next thing we're going to look at a little bit is types of periodization. And as Dr. Kramer alluded to a little bit, nonlinear periodization is a type of periodization also used to be called undulating. And really there's a lot of different patterns right now. But really the base pattern is 3 days of training per week, if there were 3 days of training, and different repetition zones on each of those 3 days. So this might be 12 to 15 reps on Monday, 8 to 10 on Wednesday, 4 to 6 on Friday. And the order doesn't really matter. You could invert the order. You could have them with the 4 to 6 day here and the 8 to 10 day there. This looked at basically linear periodization and nonlinear periodization. And all meta-analyses go through a big process if you read them. How did they do the data search to find the studies? It's really extensive. Meta-analyses are a lot of work to actually get to that data. And then you have a measure of quality of studies. Well, basically, you're throwing out studies that don't meet your criteria for the quality or don't address the question you're trying to answer. And they usually give you background information about, in this case, what was the duration, how many days per week did they train, if we're talking about training. We're going to do this a couple of times, but it's, to me, a little eye-opening. So this is basically, for this meta-analyses, that one of the ways they assessed quality of studies. So you've got the studies here. Did the study randomize participants, and was the randomization procedure adequately described and carried out? 0 means no. So when these guys went through this, this is not a good thing from a scientific perspective in terms of quality of study. Did the study report a power analysis? No. Were the assessors blinded to treatment? Okay, so this is going to come up a couple of times. Obviously, with a training study, it's tough to blind the participants. Impossible, really. If you're going to do a study with plyometrics and plyometrics plus weight training, it's tough to say, you were in the plyometric weight training group, and the guy goes, well, all I did is plyometrics. You're not going to be able to blind the participant. But you could blind the assessors, people who measure. So in case there's an inherent bias to, I like training A versus training B, and I know you're in training A group. You have a bias built in. So you could do that. Obviously, it's tough because you've got to expand then the number of people that are in your research team. Because you got to have people that aren't going to do anything but test, really. And something else that could be, I guess, relatively easily corrected. Did the study report a 95% confidence interval? So what happened with this study? Again, so it's linear versus nonlinear periodization. Basically, no difference. This is a forest plot, which basically shows the effect size of the study and then the mean effect size of the studies collectively. And this basically shows if it's right on this line, there's no difference at all. So it just favors nonlinear just a little bit, but really not statistically at all. And this is for bench press 1 RM. Same thing for squat 1 RM. Little bit of favor for linear, but really no difference at all. So this study concludes that no difference between linear and nonlinear training programs. This is a little newer study, and it's really periodization versus non-periodization. And I think some things we want to look at here is it's on trained people, so less than a year of resistance training experience. Trained at least 1 year, if you're going to be called trained, at least 1 year of training, resistance training experience, or an athlete participating in a competitive sport at a high school, collegiate, or professional level. Now, obviously, that assumes then that that is going to force you to do weight training. It may or may not be a good assumption, right? You could have a high school team that doesn't do any weight training. Probably tougher to find than it was 10 years ago, but it could still be possible. Kind of the same little thing, and we'll do this really quickly. Was the allocation concealed? Again, no. Well, it's tough, right? Going to tell people, forget what you were doing, not going to work. Unless maybe you're my mother at 94 who's got some short-term memory issues. Okay, maybe you could blind her. No, Mom, you didn't do that. You did something else. And she, oh, okay, yeah, good. Because she doesn't want to say she doesn't remember. Whoopsie. Oh, where am I going? Oh, going the wrong way? I guess so. Back here. Same thing. you know, were this is in case the therapist, the trainer's blinded. Again, obviously tough to blind the trainers when you're doing this training. But again, you could blind the assessors. But again, that increases the size of your research team. This study concluded that periodized training was better than non-periodized, but there was no difference between nonlinear and linear. You might look at that and go, hey, you know, how did these two studies come up with two different conclusions? And this is one of the reasons that you have to look at the context of the study, or in this case, the context of the meta-analysis. The goal of the previous meta-analysis was to actually compare linear versus nonlinear. So they did an exhaustive search to find studies that met their criteria to fit into linear versus nonlinear. This meta-analysis was actually periodization versus no periodization, and obviously they had two periodization models in there, linear and nonlinear. As a sub-analysis, they did the comparison of linear versus nonlinear, but they did not do an exhaustive search to find studies that just compared linear to nonlinear. They did an exhaustive search to find periodized versus non-periodized. So they missed, if you will, some of the studies that just did comparison linear to nonlinear. So you get a different group of studies, and it's a sub-analysis. So that's the reason that you probably come up with a different conclusion in linear versus nonlinear. But if you didn't pay attention to that, you'd run around saying, hey, this study shows really well that nonlinear is better. But again, you didn't put it in context of what they were trying to look at. Okay. Periodization model did show, as previous models, studies have shown, that periodization does produce greater gains than non-periodized. Training status did have an effect, actually bigger effects with less trained. Study length, bigger effects with longer training studies. Okay, that makes some sense, right? You can train longer. Training frequency, also significant effect. And this is just kind of a summary of those. Kind of touched on all these. Did come to the conclusion that short studies probably favor on-trained individuals due to what Dr. Kramer talked a bit about, neural adaptations. So you got to look at the length of study. Short studies may favor greater improvements or no difference between groups because you have mostly neural adaptations that result in strength gains. Longer studies, bigger strength gains. Most studies, short-term, kind of a knock on the studies that were looked at. Training frequency, so this is days per week. And so higher training frequency produce greater strength gains. But you have to look again a little at the studies, and that is, if you were designing a strength training study, how many days per week are you going to train? 3, right? Popular. And you go Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Students can go home for the weekend, whatever. 3 days a week is popular. If you look at a lot of studies that we do and you try to compare training frequency, it's really biased towards 2 or 3 days per week because that's what everybody trains. So it's tough to say, I'm going to have a comparison of 1 versus 3. 1 versus 4 or 5 days per week. There's just not many studies out there that do that. So you're limited in a really nice conclusion based upon the data you can put into the meta-analysis. Let's see. This study looked at something that has I've talked about in previous talks, and that is when you look at the meta-analyses, looking at training volume or training frequency, you could have a very high training frequency, 4 days per week, 5 days per week, but only train 1 set of each exercise, right? Your frequency would be high. Your total training volume would be low. You could train 2 days a week and train with 6 sets per exercise. Training frequency is relatively low, but training volume could be relatively high. So this meta-analysis tried to sort that out a little bit. So the other aspect of that is they tried to look at multi-joint exercise training volume, single joint or not, single joint exercise training volume, and then also combine them. Because that's also a weakness. You could say that you did 6 sets of leg press, a multi-joint exercise. Okay, you got 6 sets for the quads, let's say. Or you could do 3 sets of leg press and 3 sets of knee extension. 6 sets for the quads. So if you count up sets, training volume is the same. So they tried to sort that out a little bit. And they divided the studies up into low, less than 5 sets, moderate, 5 to 9 sets, and high, greater than 10 sets. So this is looking at not sets per exercise, but sets per muscle group, or tried to look at that. Again, a little bit of background on what they looked at. Now, they did limit the studies to, they had to train to volitional exhaustion. So that was one of their criteria. So all the studies included in this meta-analysis were supposed to be done to temporary fatigue, momentary failure, whatever term you want to use. Again, a description of kind of the studies, 8 to 26 weeks, average age, weekly frequency, 2 to 4. Again, frequency is tough to do. You can't find many studies that train 1 day a week unless it's a maintenance type study. It's tough to find studies that train 5, 6 days a week. Mean training intensity, I think pretty normal. Sets, 1 to 12 again, but they tried to sort that out. They counted the sets for single joint and multi-joint exercises, and repetition range 3 to 18, kind of, pretty normal too. So what happened? So this is looking at multi-joint and exercise and isolation exercises, single joint combined number of sets. The effect size for the low number of sets, which is less than 5 or 5 or less, the moderate, which was 5 to 10 and greater than 10, because of the number of studies they had, they combined those 2 groups, and the effect size is greater with more sets, considering both single and multi-joint exercises. This is looking at a little different comparison, but same idea, multi-joint and isolation, single joint exercises, simply looking at the low frequency or lowest number of sets, 5 or less, and then 5 to 10, and again, favors higher number of sets when you combine those. This one is looking at only the multi-joint exercises. So now you're counting just number of sets for multi-joint exercises. And you get the same thing. Favors the multi-joint exercises, effect size for the less than 5, effect size for, in this case, adding up, because there's a few data points, or not that many studies, of the 5 to 10 and the greater than 10 sets. But again, favors multiple sets. And then if you do the same thing for isolation exercises, get rid of the multi-joint exercises, favors the multi-set training. And again, actually here the effect size is relatively large difference. So I think this kind of sorted out what was a weakness when we looked at previous meta-analyses looking at training volume, and that is the older meta-analyses looked at number of sets per exercise. This tried to look at number of sets per muscle group by combining multi-joint and single joint exercises. Okay, this kind of looked at a specific 1RM, and you get the same thing. Favors the higher training volume. So if you look at that, still have complicated by training status. They included, basically beginning lifters, moderately trained lifters, etc. But it does indicate that for whether you're a novice or an advanced, basically 5 to 10 or greater than 10 or greater than less than 5. Sets per muscle group, not sets per exercise. Plyometrics used by a lot of sports, obviously, and important for a lot of sports. So this is an older one, older meta-analyses, looking at, again, a description of what are the studies, and again, they went through a large process. So the average decrease in time that the plyometrics resulted is 0.08, so not quite a tenth of a second. No significant difference in the difference in time between 10 to 100 meters, but the biggest change was 10 to 40 meters. In other words, plyometrics were most effective in decreasing your time or increasing your performance in shorter sprints, 10 to 40 meters. So the difference at 100 meters is really, you got faster at 40 meters and held that difference for the next 60 meters. But the majority of the change was in the start of the race. So I think that's important for such, for sports that have shorter sprints. There's not many sports where you sprint 100 meters, right? 100-meter dash, but most sports are, football, American football, basketball, you sprint short distances. This says plyometrics can be helpful to you there. Was there a difference by age? No. Previous experience? No. Fitness level? No. Gender? No difference. Sport level? No. Meaning they looked at different sport levels, the level of performance. There was a difference by sport, and football here means soccer, which means the soccer players showed the biggest improvement. Now, well, I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean they're genetically suited to benefit from plyometrics? It doesn't mean they were in bad shape to start with. I don't know. I mean, I'd probably lean towards the idea that maybe they didn't do that many plyometrics until they actually got into a training study. Most benefit. Plyometric programs give you some guidance here. Most benefit in the first 6 to 8 weeks. That doesn't mean you didn't have benefits at 10 weeks, but again, the benefits were maintained. 3 to 4 sessions per week, 18 sessions in total as a minimal, and greater than 80 jumps per session, so a measure of volume. Although you can find studies that are contrary to this, no significant effect by combining studies, plyometrics with other types of training, meaning adding weight training. Significant for type of plyos. For improving sprint performance, use plyos with a horizontal displacement and sprint-specific plyos. So horizontal displacement is a standing long jump or successive long jumps, not vertical jumps. Sticking with plyometrics, this is just looking at children, and this does quite a few different things with children. So this is looking at plyometrics and counter movement jumps, so a vertical jump. And again, a description of the studies. They divided the kids up into what they called pre-height velocity, 10 to 13 years old. So using chronological age to estimate when the growth spurt occurs. Mid-height velocity, so 13 to 16. Post-height velocity, basically older than 16 to 18. So they included just kids 10 to 18 years old. Effect size for 10 to 13-year-old, nice one. Effect size for mid, 13 to 16, significant but not as great as younger kids. And then the biggest increase in counter movement ability with plyometric training was basically 16 to 18-year-olds. So the older they were, the greater the benefit. This is just the forest plots of those same numbers. So you have the pre-height velocity, 10 to 13. Mid-height velocity, basically 13 to 16. you get a significant change. And then the 16 to 18-year-olds, the biggest increase in terms of effect size and increasing counter movement jump ability. So plyometrics work in children, is what that says. Work a little better the older they are. This study also looked at change of direction in children. So change of direction would be a lot of different skill tests. You got shuttle runs, 505 drills, zigzag runs, a lot of different tests. So this is probably a limitation because you're mixing all of these together. They all have a change of direction component, but they're all a little different tests. Yeah, that's enough for that one. So what happened? What did they show? This is the younger kids, so 10 to 13. You do have a positive effect. The 13 to 16, a positive effect. Again, biggest effect with the 16 to 18-year-olds, and then the pooled effect, summing them all up. Again, indicating that change of direction is positively affected by plyometric training in children. And obviously, change of direction is important for a lot of sport activities. And this just looks at kind of that same information. So you have the effect size here, and this is the actual change in time in the agility test. So the young kids, 0.4 of a second. The mid kids, so this is 13 to 16, 0.71, and then 16 to 18, 0.74. So again, those are relatively big changes. 0.7 of a second can make, is a big difference in terms of change of direction. So again, what does this say? Plyometrics are effective in getting kids to change direction, which is important for a lot of sporting activities. Training frequency. So this is looking at training duration. Didn't have a significant effect on change of direction. Intensity of plyometrics. Really what you look at there is a drop jump is deemed more intense than, let's say, a standing long jump. A single leg plyometric is deemed more intense than a double leg plyometric. Although it's kind of it's qualitative, quantitative. I mean, it's not a real hard line. Other things that were looked at, the only thing that was significant was number of sessions. And here it said that the greatest effect size was 2 sessions per week, plyometrics. So some guidance in terms of training. Intensity, some effect, significant effect in terms of intensity, with higher intensity being greater effect. Training frequency, we just spent some time with training frequency, also a significant effect. So their guidelines were, what they come out with, the conclusions, 2 sessions per week for at least 7 weeks, 200 jumps per week, 75 seconds between plyometric exercises, and 48 hours between sessions as their guidelines from looking at their data. Now, I think this is something that has been discussed quite a bit. Plyometrics are supposed to be power-oriented type exercises, right? You don't say, we're going to do a plyometric. Okay, that's 1. That'd be 1 foot contact. You want the person to jump as high as possible. They're aimed at developing power. And to maintain power throughout a training session, as with no matter what the training session is, you got to have relatively long rest periods between efforts, or power is going to decrease as the session goes on. So if you want to, remember, change of direction test, counter movement jump are power-oriented exercises. That's what they looked at. This didn't look at, can you maintain repeat jump ability, which is a different characteristic. This is looking at just power output in a very short duration. Again, meta-analyses are done on a lot of different things. This is looking at something that's popular right now, maybe waning a little bit, maybe more popular a couple of years ago, chains and elastic bands. used in training. So the idea here is you have a chain or elastic band, and as the person would extend in, let's say, a squat, the more the chain would lift off of the ground, the weight gets heavier and heavier as you go up. It's important to remember that a squat and a bench press are an ascending strength curve, meaning that as your arms get straighter, you could bench press more, or as you squat from a smaller knee angle, you could squat more. And if I just say bench presses from here to here, you can do a lot. So you actually got to touch your chest and raise it up to your arm's length. You can do less. So they have ascending strength curves, which is what chains and bands do, is they increase the resistance as you get towards the end of the range of motion. So again, a description of the studies, relatively few number of studies that they included. There were more studies, but they eliminated quite a few. Overall, the chains and bands increased 1 RM 5 kilograms more than training without chains or bands, so a positive effect. Effect sizes are here. So this is no chains or bands, with chains or bands. And this was true for athletes and untrained individuals. So chains and bands were effective whether you were an athlete or an untrained individual. Delving into that a little bit more, in the trained people, 6 kilogram difference. In the untrained people, 2.5 kilogram difference. So it worked a little more effective in terms of total difference here in terms of increase. So if you're let's say a power lifter, a 6 kilogram increase in your bench press, that might be useful at a meet. Now you have to remember that this is kind of affected by your total amount of bench press. If you're bench pressing 300 to go to 312, a little more difficult than if you're bench pressing 100 and you're going to go to 114 or so. I'm sorry, 104. So even though the stronger people, the more trained, can lift more, they got percentage-wise a bigger effect, or at least the same effect. Upper body, effective in both bench press and leg press. And as you might expect, lower body, you get a bigger gain. You're lifting more weight, right? If you're squatting 400 pounds, a 1% gain is 4 pounds. If you're bench pressing 200 pounds, 1% gain is 2 pounds. So same percentage increase, just bigger numbers with the heavier weights. So what did they kind of conclude? Chains and bands are useful. They do change the strength curve. Useful in ascending strength curve exercises. Now, part of that's biased a little bit towards the studies that use chains and bands, predominantly squat and bench press. The people were biased towards this is the type of study, this is the type of exercise you should look at, because it is an ascending strength curve. So not too many people said, let's use chains or bands. In fact, none in this on arm curls. Says, well, it's not an ascending strength curve. Well, it doesn't pay to do it. So you were biased, just by people's own research biased. A couple of these studies did look at Olympic lifting movements. And one of the conclusions, although a sub-conclusion out of this meta-analysis, is that if you're doing an Olympic movement, let's say a power snatch, and the chains start to rattle a little bit, you got a balanced proprioception issue you got to deal with. Because you have to remember, in something like a full snatch, if you're really lifting what you can lift, you only got about a 2 centimeter error in the bar position. In other words, if you have got the bar overhead and it's 2 centimeters too far forward, 2 centimeters too far back, and it's truly your max, it's going to hit the ground. You're not going to be able to save it. It's got to be right where it's got to be. So they argue that maybe with some proprioception, this is useful. And if you look at a lot of the meta-analyses, what do we like to put at the end of research? More research needed, right? And here, although a lot of the meta-analyses, so we're self-fulfilling for our own job security. But with the meta-analysis, it's quality of study. Part of that conclusion is reached by quality of study. Oh, I'm doing okay. Running economy. So we're going to switch a little bit to weight training and distance type athletes. So again, meta-analysis, you go to it doesn't matter, PubMed, put in meta-analysis and whatever you want to look at. I don't care, strength, running economy, cardiovascular disease. You're going to pull up a meta-analysis on it, probably, and maybe more than one. So this is looking at running economy. Now here you're limited by, when they went through and searched for studies, they wound up with a very small number of studies that they deemed met their criteria, that were high enough quality to be included in the meta-analyses. So things, and I've mentioned these a couple of times. Number two is, were subjects randomly allocated to groups? Yet one means yes. So some studies didn't randomly allocate groups. 3, allocation was concealed. Well, again, it's kind of tough, right? You're on the cross-country team, and at the end, you didn't weight train. You thought you did, but you didn't. So tough to conceal from the participants. Okay, so we got to give ourselves that one on that. Let's see. Blinding all subjects. Again, you can't, tough to do that. Blinding all the therapists to administer the therapy. In other words, if you did the training, did you know who was in what group? Well, yeah, kind of tough not to know, right? Now, what you could do is say, you're going to train the people who do the weight training. You're going to do, someone else is going to do the distance running. And you can't talk to each other. And tell the athletes, don't tell the guy who's doing your distance training that you're doing weight training. Or vice versa. But again, people are people, probably tough to do that. And then blinding the assessors, number 7. Testers. That you can do. But again, it's an administrative logistics thing where you have to have more people involved in your research team. This is just used pretty good distance athletes, right? You look at their VO2s. So that was one of their criteria. So it'd be a pretty good group of resistance athletes. I'm sorry, distance athletes. So what happened? So this is really addressing, does weight training affect running economy? That's their base question. So, and you have to, again, what is the question that they're trying to address? They're not addressing, does resistance training improve VO2 max? Not addressing, does resistance training increase your ventilatory threshold? The question is, does resistance training increase running economy or affect running economy? So this favors the experimental group, the group that did resistance training, and the answer is yes. The effect size, relatively large. It's basically 2.5 mLs per kg at a particular pace decrease, so that's pretty good. One of the things you have to look at with this particular meta-analysis, so it did increase running economy, meaning you could run the same pace using less oxygen, or if you want to inverse it, at the same oxygen consumption, you could run a little faster, however you want to look at that question. But you have to look at what did they do for the resistance training, and that's going to limit then your conclusions. So your conclusion just can't be resistance training improves running economy. Because the studies that did resistance training did 2 to 4 exercises, used 40 to 70% 1RM, not the failure. They did use plyometrics, and they trained 2 to 3 days per week. So you have to limit your conclusions to this type of training. That is just, that's just a product of the studies that were plugged into this particular meta-analysis. So you can't just make the blanket statement, resistance training improves running economy. You got to have the caveat, this type of resistance training improves running economy, because that's what went into the meta-analysis. Okay, strength training in youth athletes. Does it pay to do resistance training in kids? They were looking at a lot of different sports over here. Again, a description of the types of training. Now, obviously, one thing here is they came up with a relatively large number of papers, but it's combining free weights machines, combination free weights machines, functional training, plyometrics, complex training, a lot of different variables plugged into what is training here. Again, what did the studies do for training? 1 to 3 sessions per week, number of exercises, set, reps per set, rest between sets, etc. What percentage of 1 RM? So the bottom line in terms of strength in youth athletes favors the experimental group, meaning resistance training did improve strength. In kids, I'm going a little quicker because I'm running out of time. I told you it's a new talk. I got too many, probably like everybody, too many slides, right? Vertical jump ability. Overall, did improve vertical jump ability. Sprint performance. Did improve sprint performance. Agility. And again, agility, you have the caveat of, a lot of different agility tests plugged into this meta-analysis. Did improve agility. Sport-specific performance. So a sport-specific performance would be something like, in soccer players, did kick velocity go up? In baseball players, did velocity of a pitch go up? So a sport-specific test of some kind. And significant effect there. So weight training from this meta-analysis has positive effects on a lot of different variables for young kids or youth athletes. A couple other things here from this meta-analysis. Frequency, non-significant difference between 1, 2, and 3 days per week. Vertical jump, greatest improvement in 9 to 12 weeks study durations. Kind of some training guidelines here. Agility improvements greater the longer the study. Again, so no big surprise there, right? Train longer, hopefully continues to have some positive effects. Volume, this is perhaps interesting. 5 sets greater than fewer sets. But let's go back to the beginning. One of the first studies we looked at with volume. This is number of sets per exercise. Not number of sets per muscle group. So again, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means you have to remember that caveat. So what that means is if the study did squats and knee extensions, the quads actually did, if you did 5 sets, 10 sets. And I could do this. I could say 5 sets and forget the leg extensions, right? Still, I did 5 sets per exercise. Whereas if it was compared to a study that did 5 sets of squat and 5 sets of knee extension, well, the quads had 10 sets. Rest, 3 to 4 minutes, greater improvements. So long rest periods. And greatest strength gains, 6 to 8 reps per set. It's not real light, not real heavy, but pretty heavy, right? Plyometrics. Again, a little bit of training guidelines here. 4 sets, greater improvement. 3 to 4 sets, greatest improvement. For sprint performance, this is plyometric sets. And actually, plyometric sets, again, you got a difficulty, right? If I do 5 vertical jumps in a row, okay, that would be one set, I take a break. If I did 10 vertical jumps in a row and took a rest, I had 10 jumps in that set. So again, you're counting sets here, not repetitions. Sport-specific improvement, 6 to 8 reps per set less effective than 3 to 5 and 9 to 12. There's an interesting difference there, right? Maybe a product of the number of, the number of studies in each of those breakdowns. And then vertical jump, 3 sets tended greater improvement than 4 or 5. Again, maybe a breakdown of how many studies did you have in all of those groups. Okay. Strength, both prepubertal and postpubertal, didn't make a difference. Chronological age, no difference. So could improve strength no matter what the kid's age. Chronological age, tendency, greater adolescence improvement. In sport-specific performance, no difference between men and women, or boys and girls actually. Girls, greater improvement in sport-specific performance with weight training. So what that means is, if you would compare a group of boys and girls, the girls would increase, let's say, a sport-specific performance, kicking a soccer ball with velocity, more so than their boy counterparts. Here's something else, not all maybe, but a lot of strength coaches love. Free weights, greater improvement in strength and agility. In other words, machines, when they did that comparison, free weights, use of free weights in the training gave you bigger results in strength and agility than machines. Okay, I got 4 minutes. 4.5. Concurrent training. So this means strength training and endurance training at the same time. Maybe not the same time. During the same training period. Meaning it's tough to squat and run a mile at the same time, right? You got to, but during the same training period. Similar things, got some weaknesses here. Was it random allocation? Was the investigator blinded? Were the testers blinded to what they were measuring? So same concerns there in terms of quality of studies, let's say. So what this looked at is a comparison of if you did endurance training and then did your weight training, or if you did your weight training and then did your endurance training. So it's a sequencing study. And if we look at the previous research, I'm sure most of you are aware, all of you are aware, that the concern here with concurrent training is that the studies show that weight training performed concurrently with endurance training has no effect on your endurance capabilities. In other words, doesn't negatively affect VO2 max, let's say. Whereas when you do concurrent training, there is a negative effect on your maximal strength gains or maximal power gains. In other words, doing too much endurance training negatively affects your gains in strength, but if you do weight training and endurance training at the same time, there's no negative effect on your endurance capabilities. So this is looking at lower body dynamic strength. So that could be a movement, a leg press, a squat. So this is a little tough to see, but this means you did your endurance training first and then your resistance training on this side. And this says you did your resistance training and then your endurance training. So if you want to increase lower body dynamic strength, do the resistance training before the endurance training, is what that says. Muscle hypertrophy. And these were good quality studies. Muscle hypertrophy was measured by MRI or DEXA. Do your resistance training in front of your endurance training if you want to hypertrophy. lower body static strength, so isometric strength. Really not much difference. And I think, I forget if it was who in the first two presentations, I think it was Bill, about dynamic strength versus isometric strength. He had a little something about that in there. Or maybe my memory's gone. But there's not many sporting events where static strength is really, really important. Dynamic strength is more important. And then, does it make any difference if you do your endurance training in front of your resistance training or resistance training in front of endurance training in terms of gains in endurance capabilities? The answer is no. So this supports that previous research that said concurrently training for endurance and strength has no impact on your endurance capabilities, but it does have a negative effect on maximal strength capabilities. And it says if you don't want to affect maximal strength capabilities, do your resistance training prior to your endurance training. That's where it added some knowledge to that previous research. Okay, 1 minute over. So we'll do this quickly. Concurrent training and blood pressure. You all know that endurance training and weight training actually do decrease systolic and diastolic blood pressure. I'm going to skip through this. Concurrent training does have a positive effect on systolic blood pressure, 3 millimeters of mercury. Concurrent training does have a positive effect on diastolic blood pressure, 2.5. We're going to come back to that. You may think, oh, big deal, right? It's not much. High quality studies, bigger differences. So this means blood pressure goes down. That would be the positive effect, right? If we look at previous meta-analyses in terms of blood pressure with aerobic training, systolic blood pressure, 3 to 4 millimeters of mercury, diastolic, 2 to 3. Previous meta-analyses on strength training and blood pressure decreases, 3 systolic, 3.5 diastolic, 3 for systolic and diastolic. The point of that is this concurrent training has got no positive or negative effect in decreases in blood pressure. You get the same decreases if you do endurance training alone or resistance training alone or combine them. The other thing that's interesting to me is that's the change you get in systolic and diastolic blood pressure. 3-4 millimeters of mercury. You don't drop 20 millimeters of mercury just by doing endurance training. And if you look at other research, the easiest way to decrease, not the easiest way, the most effective way to decrease blood pressure is what? Lose fat. Lose some body mass. That'll have the biggest effect on blood pressure. So with that, thank you.